Church and Culture Today. I'm Dale Hudson. My guest today is Terry Teachout, who writes on the arts for Time Magazine, for commentary for the New York Times. He also writes on film for Crisis Magazine, and that's the subject of today's conversation, the church and the cinema. Please join us. In addition to being the film critic for Crisis Magazine, Terry Teachout is a regular contributor to Time Magazine, to the Wall Street Journal, to the New York Times, to Partisan Review, to the Washington Post, and just about every major publication in the United States. Terry, welcome to the Church and Culture Today.
Dale, it's good to be here.
You know, the movies. Everybody loves the movies.
And everybody goes to the movies.
And everybody goes to the movies. No more dominant and influential art form in the world today.
I agree.
How are we doing in terms of the religious, Christian, even Catholic voice in the movies right now? What's the state of play in the film regarding those questions?
Generally speaking, not good. And it hasn't been for quite some time. Film reflects the general culture, especially in the United States, where the movies are an industry which exists to make money, the largest amount of money by reaching the largest number of people. Film, by definition, reflects the culture that it, in a sense, reports on. And that culture is, large segments of that culture, one could say, are post-Christian, post-moral. And as a result, the films that are being made about that culture reflect it, I think, quite accurately.
Do you think that it reflects the culture or reflects more the people who are in the movie business?
Well, it cuts on both sides of that line. Hollywood itself is famously, even notoriously, a post-moral environment. And there's no question that some people who make movies and make television series are making them with the purpose of trying to shape the culture.
So how do you evangelize post-morality? And by the way, is that different from amorality?
Yes, in a sense it is. To be amoral is to be someone for whom morality is, it simply never came up as an issue at all. And living in a post-moral environment means that you're living, I think, and that's what we live in now, means that you're living in one where you have deliberately decided to step away from it, to turn your back on it. The children and grandchildren of a post-moral culture may be living in an amoral culture, but I don't think we've quite gotten there yet, except in certain districts of the United States.
But what you do in Crisis Magazine is you try to find films that have some sort of serious moral or spiritual content, or may have pretensions toward it, and try to burst the bubble of those pretensions. And you've come up with a short list of films that have come out, say, in the last year or year and a half that have some pretty serious content.
Yes, I have. When I say that Hollywood and also filmmakers in Europe are not doing well with religious subject matter or morality in general, that doesn't mean that none of them are doing anything with it. In a way, if you want to be disposed in the optimistic direction, it's really quite surprising and even impressive that there are so many films of quality, maybe a half dozen every year, maybe a few more, that do, in different kinds of ways,
for example,
engage with moral issues. So, for example, Kenneth Lonergan's movie, You Can Count on Me.
Now that had Laura Linney.
Yes. and Mark Ruffalo. And Lonergan wrote and directed this film. It's his first movie.
And did he play a priest?
Yes, he played a Methodist minister, clergyman. A little cameo, but a very significant one. Now, You Can Count on Me is a movie about small-town life in a small community of upstate New York.
Missouri, so
yeah, I came from
life.
A town that looks very much like the one where the film was shot. It is a film about moral choice, but it is not an explicitly religious film. I don't have any knowledge about whether Mr. Lonergan is religious or not. But there's no question that the film takes moral matters seriously, and it also, and this is really very unusual for a Hollywood film or an American independent film, it engages directly with religious questions, because Lonergan in this film is playing a mainline Christian minister of the sort who doesn't like to talk about sin.
Right.
Laura Linney is a character who in the film is, among other things, engaged in an adulterous relationship. And
she's surprised when the minister doesn't tell her to cut it out.
Right, right. She's deeply conflicted about this. This is not your conventional sort of Hollywood, all sex is good kind of portrayal. She's very troubled about it, and she goes to her minister for counseling, the logical thing that a small-town person would do. And she says to him, "Aren't you going to tell me that this is a sin?" And he sort of looks at his shoes and says, "Well, we don't like to start with that." And this is being played.
And she's shocked.
Very, very subtly.
Yeah,
this is being played for laughs, but at the same time, it is a very serious commentary on the state of
religion,
of moral discourse in mainline Protestant faith in America.
Now,
and the fact that it's being played just a little bit for laughs, a little bit satirically, is part of what gives it its force.
Now, if we're going to talk about specific films, we have to say to the audience, these films might shock them, their sexual content. I don't think it's a very tough content in this particular film.
No, there's a little bit of partial nudity, I guess you would say. There's quite a bit of the same amount of moderately rough language that you would be likely to hear in most Hollywood
films. We want to warn our
films.
audience that they may not want to watch these films if that really disturbs them, but on the other hand, even if they don't watch it, they need to know that this is the state of affairs in the film world, that there are movies like this addressing these issues in a serious way that might actually lead to people thinking twice about the way they're living their lives.
Yes, it is important, I think, not to be deceived by surface matters in art, especially art that tries to represent the way we live now, the way American culture is like now, the way a post-moral environment operates. This doesn't mean that all films have to be wall-to-wall carpeted with four-letter words, but it does mean that it is a perfectly responsible artistic and moral strategy for filmmakers to try to show certain aspects of the world as it is.
What do you say to the person who says, well, you know what, I know it's out there, but when I go to the movies, I really don't want to see it represented?
I would say don't go to those movies.
Yeah.
If you really don't want to see or hear things like this, it is perfectly legitimate for you not to go to new movies. I wouldn't blame you a bit.
What about this movie Left Behind that purported to be a great Christian film that was marketed through specific evangelical churches?
Well, it's a very naive film.
You've seen it?
I have seen it.
Yeah.
It is a film arising from evangelical fundamentalist ideas about the rapture, the end of times, what happens then. It's a kind of it's adapted from a series of novels that are about the end times. And it is a movie in which, although there is an adulterous relationship, we don't see anybody having sex, and we don't hear any four-letter words, and it passes those tests impeccably. As a piece of art, and I would also say as a piece of moral discourse, it's very defective.
Does our sort of nascent American Puritanism get in the way of our conversation and discourse about the art?
I think very much it does. And this is a perspective that I think really arises from a certain kind of Protestant heritage in the United States, where people in the first place feel that all art is a little suspicious, that we really shouldn't want to be interested in anything that isn't directly for the purpose of bringing souls closer to Christ. There are, as you know, many...
The key word there was directly.
Right. There are many churches that in this country, fundamentalist churches, that don't want to have any kind of music at all. They come from a culture that, unlike the Catholic culture, doesn't see art as a useful
It's too
instrument.
sensuous. It's too sensuous.
That's right. That's right.
But a movie like You Can Count on Me can do it in very powerful ways indirectly. When I watched You Can Count on Me with my wife, it was so honest, so real, and so painful, I almost couldn't watch it all the way through to the end.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
And I think in our time, at this moment, in this post-moral moment, art that is realistic, that shows us the way large parts of the world is bound to be painful, because the world is in a painful state.
And then you find religiously serious people saying, oh, it's depressing, I don't want to watch it, as if depressing somehow disqualifies art.
Yes, that is a short-sighted.
It's a
cop-out. It's a short-sighted view of what art does, but it's also a way, I think, of turning your face from the state of the world. And we don't want to do that. We want to engage with the world. And it's important for us to remember that the truth is Christian. Reality, portrayals of reality, accurate artistic portrayals of reality, are by definition religious, because they show us the world as it is.
I mean, what has John Paul II been saying over and over again, but engage with the world, engage with the world, because take culture seriously, work to transform, understand it and transform it.
And he has said this specifically with reference to film, because he understands, being a man of great shrewdness about the nature of culture and the media.
And an artist.
Yeah, and an artist himself. He understands how important movies and television are. They reach people. They are enormously powerful simply as a way of communicating. My feeling now is that film has become what I call the master narrative medium of culture. It's more important than novel is.
Speaking of master narrative, we're going to come back in a few moments and talk about a great master of the cinema, Alfred Hitchcock. Back with Terry Teachout in just a moment. Welcome back to the Church and Culture Today. My guest is Terry Teachout, who writes about movies for Crisis Magazine, but he also writes on the arts for many other publications such as Time, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times. And Terry, we were on the verge of talking about the great master Alfred Hitchcock, who was a Catholic, educated by Jesuits, fan of Father Brown Mysteries, G.K. Chesterton,
and whose films are permeated with a sense of sin, perhaps more than any other major filmmaker, certainly any other major filmmaker that was active in Hollywood. Hitchcock's movies look at human behavior from a perspective that is unmistakably religious. It isn't usually explicitly religious, except in his film I Confess with Montgomery Clift, but anyone who is alive to the existence of sin in the world cannot but understand what Alfred Hitchcock is making movies about. He's making movies about sin and obsession and doubt and fear.
Is this what keeps them fresh? I mean, when I go back to Hitchcock films, I find like I'm almost watching them for the first time over and over again.
Yes, they partake of the most universal thing in the world, original sin. You know, if that's your subject matter, your films are not going to date, no matter how much they're involved in a particular historical moment, because they're about something that is always with us.
I should confess that I watch Rear Window 3 or 4 times a year. I just find it fascinating as he finds the murder across the courtyard. I find that movie.
Yes, Rear Window, Vertigo, which most people think is his greatest film. Even in the lighter films like North by Northwest, which are entertainments in the same way that Graham Greene wrote entertainments and serious novels, there's no question that these entertainments are taking place in a world where evil exists. Even if, in the case of a film like North by Northwest, the evil is being played for laughs, there's no question that the moral stakes are high. And
The Birds.
Yes, The Birds is in a way the most serious and concentrated of all Hitchcock's films.
Why do you say that?
For one thing, because it contains no background music. Bernard Herrmann, who wrote Hitchcock's scores, the greatest of all film composers, supplied no music for the film. Instead, he created the sounds of synthesized bird calls to use on the soundtrack. This increases the claustrophobic atmosphere of this film, which closes down on a single town, and like, you know, the iris in filmmaking as it gets tighter and tighter, the focus eventually becomes on a single person in a single room or a single phone booth being attacked by these birds that are obviously more than birds, that have become charged by some kind of demonic energy and are showing the people in the film something about themselves.
You know, there's another source of demonic energy in the film that I've never quite understood, and perhaps you can answer my question. Rod Taylor's mother is so hostile toward Tippi Hedren, the female lead character. In fact, she's just, you can tell that she's almost threatening in her demeanor toward Tippi Hedren. Why is that?
Well, it's a theme that Hitchcock liked to touch on in films, and I don't think in this case there's any question but that we see in the mother the desire for overprotection, the unwillingness to let the son become an adult, to move into his own life. Fear of sexuality, I think, is no question about it. But even a fear of allowing it to be channeled into the appropriate channel. She simply doesn't want him to follow the destiny of all human beings and become an adult in his own right.
Is there something analogous to the birds themselves there? I've always thought that there was some kind of layering in the birds that began with the birds, nature turning on the human beings in the town, and then the mother turning on her son as the moment another female comes into his life.
That's a good interpretation. I think it's quite credible. But one of the reasons why Hitchcock is a real artist, like a great novelist is an artist, is because, to use a phrase that Henry James used, his symbols are open. They don't automatically lead you to a single interpretation. Art that has very closed and narrow symbols doesn't give the human imagination room for doubt, room for exploration, room for wondering, most of all room for mystery. The thing that separates morally serious art, especially art that has a Catholic perspective, from less morally serious art, is that it has room for mystery.
No, that way you can go back
simple.
to it over and over again.
Yes, that's right. You don't want a work of art to be like an equation that you solve, and at the end you know that x equals 1, because if it is, once you've solved it, you don't need to solve it again. You already did that. The wonderful thing about art is that there is a core to it that is insoluble, just like the human mystery itself. The
is there any redemption in Hitchcock, or is it all just laying out the different versions of original sin?
You find redemption in Hitchcock in the comic films.
Trouble with Harry.
Trouble with Harry. North by Northwest in particular, which ends in a marriage.
Right.
And that's the same place that you find it in a great deal of art. The difference between comedy and tragedy in art often is that comic art will resolve in a kind of a general redemption. But even though that's very important, Hitchcock's light films are just as good, just as important as his serious ones. I don't think it's the center of his expression in his interests as an artist. You find those in films like Vertigo and The Birds that deal in obsession, deal in sin, and characteristically end in tragedy and failure.
Why do you say Vertigo is the best of his films?
Partly, it's simply because the whole package is so effective. It has extraordinary performances by James Stewart and Kim Novak, two of the best performances in modern filmmaking. It has Bernard Herrmann's score, which is so good that you can listen to it separate from the film and enjoy it. It also is a wonderful script by slipped my mind. Not Ernest Lehman, because he wrote North by Northwest, Samuel Fuller. But also you feel that, as you often feel when an artist hits the dead center of his own concerns, you feel that every aspect of the film is moving toward its climax. It's as though you're on, that train in North by Northwest. It's as though you're on a train that is headed into a completely black tunnel.
Someone that you're a big fan of who is reaching his prime of film making is Whit Stillman.
Yes. Whit Stillman, a fairly young man, still in his 40s, who has made 3 feature films, Metropolitan, Barcelona, and The Last Days of Disco, is a filmmaker who uses comedy to express morally serious ideas about contemporary life. That is a way of filmmaking that I myself find particularly sympathetic. Generally speaking, comedy is greater art than tragedy. It's certainly more subtle, and it's also more in keeping with our recognition that for the Christian life is not tragic. We mustn't disdain happy endings the way that so many intellectuals do. Happy endings are the desired end of life. And Whit Stillman, who is a person who takes religion very seriously, even though he doesn't usually portray it explicitly in his films, is also a filmmaker who, in showing the lives of young, privileged Eastern Americans, 2 of his films are set in New York City, takes their lives and their moral choices quite seriously.
He turned his last film into a rather successful novel, I believe, which I believe we have.
Yes, this is Whit's own novelization of the film The Last Days of Disco.
Now, is this the first time someone has taken a screenplay and turned it into a novel? Or?
It's the first time that the person who wrote the screenplay turned it into a novel. Novelizations are fairly common in the paperback business, but we're not talking about a serious filmmaker who took a serious film and turned it into a serious novel. These are young people who have moral instincts and suddenly find themselves released into, in The Last Days of Disco, the world of the New York disco scene in the 80s, which is about as post-moral as you can get. And they're floundering, and they're making mistakes, including, in a couple of instances, sexual relationships which are entirely inappropriate. Which are played in an enormously touching way for comedy, the comedy of our sympathy for their dilemma. But we never doubt the way things should be, and the movie shows these young people trying to find what that way is in a world where the moral signposts have been removed. That's part of what makes it so touching.
So in the work of Kenneth Lonergan and Whit Stillman, we have morally serious and religiously sensitive filmmakers presently working, young men. Does this mean we can be optimistic about the future of film?
I don't think one should ever be too optimistic about the world of popular culture in America, but people like Lonergan and Stillman do show us that it is possible to go into the Hollywood environment, which is quite corrupted, and pull out of it films that can be successful, that can deal in a serious way with moral issues, and also can do it with a light touch, that are not moral propaganda, but are real art. The fact that such people exist and are working today is certainly a cause for optimism.
And that certainly raises the possibility of conversion in the audience when there's a light touch.
I think so too.
People don't want to be browbeaten.
They don't want to be browbeaten. They don't want to be preached to, and it's important to remember that while a sermon can be artful, it is not art, because it is instrumental. It has a purpose in mind. That's not the way art works. But art, by being alive to moral complexity, by having a moral and imagination, by showing people grappling with moral issues in a serious way, art can, by all of these workings, bring us all closer to God. That's what great art does.
Terry Teachout, thank you for being my guest today on The Church and Culture. And this is just the first of a number of conversations I'll have with Terry Teachout. I hope you'll join us for the rest. Thanks for being with us. Welcome to The Church and Culture Today. I'm Dale Hudson, and I'd like to welcome back my guest, Terry Teachout, who writes on the arts for Time, for Commentary, for the New York Times and the Washington Post, and he reviews films for Crisis Magazine, which is the topic of today's discussion. We're going to talk about classic American films. We'll be right back. Terry Teachout, you were saying earlier that a lot of people think of classic American movies mainly as entertainments, as diversions, but you claim that they have some serious content. What do you think? Are you thinking just of film noir, or are you thinking of other films as well?
Oh no, I think most particularly in film noir and the Western.
Remind everybody what film noir is.
Film noir are that's French for dark film or black film, and they're the films that were made, most of them immediately after World War II. They tend to be detective movies, movies about innocent people who were pulled into circumstances beyond their control.
Like Humphrey Bogart, Alan Ladd,
right.
Fred
McMurray in Double Indemnity, which is one of the very first film noirs. They're not just mysteries. There are movies specifically about fear and sin and people who partake of the human dilemma of original sin and suddenly find themselves sucked into situations that they weren't counting on. It's a genre that lasted for about 6 or 7 years after the war and was very popular, but also very morally serious, just as the Western, which we think of as the ultimate form of shoot-'em-up film entertainment. Westerns, classic Hollywood Westerns, are in fact among the most serious, morally serious films that Hollywood or anybody else
What
ever
titles
produced.
come to mind when you think of Western and morally serious?
Well, I particularly like the films that Randolph Scott made with a director named Bud Bedecker. 7 Men from Now, The Tall T, Ride Lonesome. Many of John Wayne's films, particularly the ones that he did with the director John Ford,
Who was Catholic?
have this kind of moral seriousness. Films like The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, The Searchers, which most people agree, and I agree with them, is very possibly the best Western ever made. But even the lightest Westerns tend to focus on a particular set of moral issues.
By the way, is the Western dead? I just want to know, is it dead?
No, it's not dead. It's not popular like it was in the 40s and 50s, but we still have people coming along, like Clint Eastwood, for example, or the makers of the film Tombstone, who understand.
Wonderful movie.
Yeah, these are people who understand that the Western is about what people lightly call, and they shouldn't say it lightly, the code of the West. Most Westerns are about an individual who finds himself faced with some kind of serious, high-stakes moral choice.
High noon.
High noon. Should he engage in vengeance? So many Westerns are motivated by the quest for vengeance. What is his responsibility if a friend is killed? Many Westerns are about the creation of or reestablishment of order in a morally chaotic setting. That's really where the Western becomes intensely moral, because the West is presented, and this is pretty much what it was like, as an environment into which civilization has not yet moved, into which people are coming. There aren't any churches.
So many Western rule of law, which we've been hearing so much about lately.
That's right. You have this world where people can do whatever they want. There's no law. There are no churches. And then moving into it is a lonely man like John Wayne or Randolph Scott, who finds himself presented with a moral dilemma without the moral environment of civilization in which to tell him what to do. Yeah. And he has to look within himself to what we call the code of the West to decide what he should do. And what else is he looking at? What else is he seeking for but natural law?
Terry, you make me proud to be from Texas listening to you talk. And so you see then in the Western something that is perennially about order, law, bringing, as you put it, order into chaos. But isn't it also about integrity and about courage and about the virtues as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very much about the virtues. This is the aspect of Westerns that people who are themselves not morally serious like to joke about. They like to joke about good guys and bad guys, white hats and black hats. And we who understand that moral issues are serious recognize immediately that the discourse in Westerns, although it may be simplified, although very often it's not, but even if it's presented in a simplified way, it is nevertheless a way that takes the existence of these issues seriously. There is never any question in a Western that some things are right and some things are wrong. And the most interesting Westerns are the place where, are the ones where the hero may be forced to choose against what he initially perceives as competing rights.
Well, I think that's true in The Searchers, where John Wayne is chasing after Natalie Wood's character, who's 8 or 9 years old, who's been stolen from his sister by the Indians, and her mother's been killed by the Indians. And he goes after
his brother and sister-in-law.
He spends 5 years trying to find her, his niece, because she's being raised by Indians with the sole intention of killing her once he finds her.
That is an extraordinary thing for us to see in a John Wayne movie. Part of the impact of The Searchers comes from the fact that having spent a lifetime looking at John Wayne movies, as most of us have, we expect to see him as a very straightforward hero. I mean, he may be a rough guy, cut up, he may do the odd wrong thing from time to time, but basically he's centered on the code of the West, and he does the right thing. In The Searchers,
he's racism.
Yes, he construes his responsibility as being to kill this girl because she has been raised by and consorted romantically with Indians, and that means that he has to purify the race by doing away with her.
We don't want to tell people what happens.
No, we won't tell people what happens, but to see John Wayne, our hero, in this compromised integrity is an unbelievably powerful experience.
You know, as you're talking, I'm thinking, I grew up with these films, not because I knew they were good, but because they were there.
Yeah.
Yet now, but now, I guess they're there more now with cable than they were pre-cable, because it's part of the environment of anybody who has a TV and is hooked into cable to see The Searchers or to see The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. But there was a time when you had to make a special effort either to tune in late at night on television or to go to the beginnings of the video store to get these films.
The invention of the VCR is the thing that has made film something we can talk about in the same way that we talk about books or a piece of music that we have a recording of. Before that, the history of film was only accessible to people in large cities who lived near revival houses, and then they could only watch the things that the revival house brought in, and if they were prepared to stay up until 3 in the morning, they could see these great old westerns and film noirs from the 40s. And now, with Turner Classic Movies and American Movie Channel and with our video stores, we have access essentially to the whole history of film. It's one of the reasons why we now understand that Hollywood films, that there was more to them than just grinding out product for entertainment.
What about the musical? As you know, I'm a great fan of the traditional classic Rodgers and Hammerstein, Lerner and Loewe musical. Can't the musical also be seen as a source of some sort of beneficial moral reflection or at least sensibility?
Oh, of course. Absolutely. Like all love stories that end in union or reunion, in which conflicts to love are overcome, the musical comedy, with its heightened language of emotion that comes through music, through song, gives us at the end, in a more modest way, but nevertheless real, the same feeling of moral reconciliation and sometimes even redemption that we seek from serious art.
You know, I think I've said to you before, when I've had what I consider a great musical experience, whether it's absolute music as a symphony or a great musical comedy, it's not just reconciliation, I feel, it's possibility. I feel as if I'm capable of more than I thought I was capable of.
Yes, and I feel, this is one of the things that I want to feel from certain kinds of art, I feel healed. We live in this corrupted world, this, as I've said on another occasion, in this post-moral world. We live under the aspect of modernity and post-modernity, and one of the things that art reminds us is that lives can be whole, and that sundered lives can be made whole.
But didn't Stephen Sondheim challenge that expectation in his treatment of the musical after, say, the dominant age of Rodgers and Hammerstein, Lerner and Loewe and so forth?
Yes, Sondheim is the first composer. He writes lyrics and music for his shows. He's the first songwriter of musical comedy who has tried to make comedies that reflect modernity in its ideas, that reflect the ambivalence and uncertainty that prevail in a post-moral age. And they can have, and the best of them do have, the kind of power that comes from showing us the world as it is now.
Haven't some of his, or at least early musicals, been made into films, and they're therefore become part of the tradition of musical comedy in film?
Well, they haven't. Sondheim hasn't. His own shows, not the ones that he did in collaboration with Leonard Bernstein, like West Side Story, or Julie Stein, like Gypsy. Of his own shows, the only one that has been filmed is A Little Night Music, and it's not an effective film, unfortunately. Those musicals came along after Hollywood, for a variety of complicated reasons, had more or less given up on the idea of musical comedy. And musical comedy is rather hard to translate into cinematic terms. I think most of the best film musical comedies are not adaptations of the classic Hollywood shows, but things like the Fred Astaire movies that were actually conceived in terms of the screen directly. It's awfully hard to film a stage show. To make it work, and I happen to think that the best film adaptation of a classic Broadway musical comedy is The Music Man.
Well, hold on, we'll come back to that. Terry Teachout and I are talking about film noir, the Western, musical comedy, classic American movies. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Church and Culture. Today my guest is Terry Teachout. We're talking about classic American films. Now, why do you like The Music Man so much?
Because it doesn't try to be anything other than what it is, which is a stage show that has been filmed. Most of the big classic Broadway musicals like Oklahoma were shot in very widescreen processes like CinemaScope. They were opened up with lots of exteriors. An attempt was made to translate them into the language of the film, and usually doesn't work. A movie like West Side Story, which on the stage, that musical has tremendous force and concentration, becomes diffuse and kind of bloated when you put it in actual outdoor settings and with this big widescreen photography. Any musical that depends on dance is not going to look good if you do it that way. The Music Man uses most of the original cast of the Broadway show. Very often it puts them in what are quite obviously sound stages, which don't look like a real outdoor setting. There are even theatrical fades of the lighting at the ends of scenes. It's not an attempt to reproduce the stage show, but it acknowledges that there's something, this is an artificial performance going on. And you also have
which
Robert,
you don't mind, which you don't mind
I think
at all.
in fact that's part of what makes it good, because it's not trying to pull the material away from something that's unnatural to it and put it in a naturalistic setting, which just doesn't work.
But you know, in the three genres we've been talking about, the Western, film noir, and the musical, only the Western survives. I mean, I think you could say that the musical is pretty well dead.
Yes.
And
we have
at least on film.
Right. We have a genre called neo-noir, which they're all in color, for one thing, which is a fundamental mistake. Film noir is supposed to be in black and white. But there have been some quite good movies made in recent years, like L.A. Confidential, which use the language of noir. But because they're shot in color and on wide screens, some of the concentration of that genre is lost. And you also, this is a rule to live by. Anytime somebody calls something neo, it means that they're not doing the thing, but they're doing a kind of commentary on the thing, so it's once removed from the original. But people do still occasionally make really good Westerns, and one of the reasons why that works is because the Western does actually lend itself to widescreen filming and to color.
Now, going back to some of the classic films that we all love, for example, we at Christmas time we watch It's a Wonderful Life.
Yes.
Now, is that supposed to be an upper or a downer at Christmas time?
Well, now, most people who talk about the film talk about its upper aspect, the last 5 minutes, and that's important. This movie is supposed to have a happy ending. But unlike superficial movies with happy endings, It's a Wonderful Life earns its happy ending because it shows us James Stewart, one of the most interesting and complex actors of the Hollywood period, brought to the edge of despair. Now, when we talk about Jimmy Stewart, I don't think that's the first thing on our lips. We think of him as this charming gentleman. But in fact, in so many of his films, in all of the Westerns that he made, and he was very good in Westerns, in Hitchcock's Vertigo, and even in It's a Wonderful Life, which we think of as this Hollywood festive film, we see a man who is looking into the abyss, who shows us fear, who shows us anxiety, who shows us doubt. And he's able to find that fear within himself and put it on the screen so that when there is a resolution, as at the end of It's a Wonderful Life, the resolution is all the more powerful because he has gone somewhere and come back from it.
And there are real villains in It's a Wonderful Life.
There are most definitely real villains.
Lionel Barrymore.
Yeah, he's portrayed as a kind of a comic opera villain, but after all, the stakes are high.
Right.
And we're talking about the future of Jimmy Stewart's life and the future of this town.
Frank Capra, as a director, who directed It's a Wonderful Life, was Catholic.
Yes.
And he made quite a few famous films. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, another film with Jimmy Stewart. My personal favorite comedy of all time, Bringing Up Baby, with Cary.
Yeah, that's Howard Hawks.
Is that Howard Hawks?
That's Howard. I know
I've
this
been attributing
I
that
just
to him.
happened to watch it a few days ago on television. It's a classic of the genre that's now known as screwball comedy,
right.
Which are, of course, comedies of reconciliation after great tension and absurdity.
Just tell me, did Hawks make any other movies that funny, that good? Because I want to go watch them.
I think Hawks actually made quite a few movies that are that funny. I Was a Male War Bride with Cary Grant, one of the lesser known of his successful movies, and Hawks was a man who always liked to make the serious funny. So in films that we don't think of nominally as comedies, like the Western Rio Bravo or his adaptation of Hemingway.
Did he make Rio Bravo?
He made Rio
I
Bravo.
love Rio Bravo.
Or his adaptations of The Big Sleep and To Have and Have Not. These are not comedies, they're Westerns, film noir, but they're funny. They're full of life and interaction.
So Hawks is actually a good example of the kind of American classic movie that has this serious side.
Yes.
Not just entertaining, not just diverting. But the interesting thing that, we began this discussion is that any film to have an impact has to be entertaining. It has to be diverting in a certain way.
Any work of art, in order to have an impact, has to pull us in. Art can't be completely rebarbative. We don't want to look at it and be repelled by it at first glance. Otherwise, we won't sit down to experience it.
Do you think, do you have any evidence, because I know you're a student of the biographies of these people and the history of Hollywood, the culture of Hollywood, when Howard Hawks or Frank Capra or John Ford sat down to craft a film, did they think of the influence on the audience? For example, when John Ford made Three Godfathers, which is perhaps his only explicitly Catholic religious movie, where John Wayne ends up and two other guys in the West end up taking care of a little baby at Christmas time. Were they thinking about the impact, the moral, spiritual impact, personal impact on their audience? Were they thinking this is going to be good for the audience to see?
Ford might have been when he made that film. Hawks certainly wouldn't have been. Capra, I think, was very conscious of the desire, at least in some of his films, to make films that were, I'm not using this word with any touch of irony, films that were uplifting.
Inspirational. I mean, Mr. Smith Comes to Washington almost becomes kitschy at a certain point.
Yeah, it goes a bit far, but it's on the side of the angels, and thus is forgivable. Different filmmakers had different attitudes about this. Hollywood, as a policy, in the classic period, wanted to make films that were uplifting. I find, in general, that films that set out very deliberately to be uplifting end up being heavy-handed. This is why it strikes me that so much of the best of Hollywood, and often so much of the most morally serious work in Hollywood, is made in films that don't set out to make a big moral statement, like your average Western. They work with a limited deck of cards, a certain number of more or less prescribed plot elements.
Well, Terry, but as you know as well as I do, there are a lot of well-intentioned Catholics and Christians and other religious people who go into the arts and they write a screenplay, or they write a novel, or they paint a picture, or they compose a mass with the sole intention of making a big statement, of having a moral, spiritual impact, of getting a message out. What you're saying here is that runs the risk of ruining their art.
It has a tendency to backfire, not just in specific terms of making a moral statement, but also a person who sets out to make a masterpiece. That's usually the best way to make sure that you're not going to make a masterpiece, because it means that all of your decisions are going to be directed towards, oh, I have to make this big, I have to make it elevating, I have to make it serious, when what you should be saying to yourself is, I have to make this real.
Beautiful.
They're the same thing.
Yeah.
And if you set out to make a work of art in a modest way, a way fitting to a human being, and say, I'm just going to try to show a piece of the world as it is, to really capture the flavor of human life, then of course you are capturing part of the flavor of creation.
How good is Gone with the Wind as an American film classic? Does it fit into this species you're talking about?
Well, it's funny. I was just writing about the novel, which is better than the film, and it's also more serious than the film. The novel, in some ways, is quite surprisingly serious. You don't think about that, because essentially what we now think about is the film. A lot of the novel's quite specific and explicit and interesting commentary about the Southern cause, about the Civil War. The novel is really quite ambivalent about the lost cause. This gets lost in the film. It's clipped out because it wouldn't have suited their purposes. Gone with the Wind is wonderful entertainment. It is a very beautiful film to look at. I was just watching a restored print of it the other day. The Technicolor is gorgeous. It has a perfect performance by Clark Gable.
What about Leslie Howard?
I think that's a perfect performance too, as a matter of fact. He really conveys the lost hope and despair of this character. It's not a great film. It doesn't come from a great source. It is too long. But it's not unserious.
Great film score.
Max Steiner. That's a beautiful piece of
the audience.
scoring.
The audience should know that you and I are both great devotees of film music.
Yes, film music deserves to be taken more seriously than it tends to be. A lot of it was written by composers of very serious purpose, and some of it was written actually by great composers. Aaron Copland wrote some of the best film scores for commercial Hollywood movies, of Mice and Men, on the town, Our Town, The Heiress, and William Walton, of course, scored Laurence Olivier's Henry V. But then there are also wonderful composers whose names are not well known in the concert hall, like Bernard Herrmann, who scored Vertigo, Miklos Rocha, who scored most of those great biblical epics, but also Double Indemnity.
Right.
These are real composers, and it's always worth listening to the music when you go to the movies.
In the 1 minute that's left, give us 3 movies we should watch that perhaps we don't know the names of, as much as It's a Wonderful Life that we should watch as examples of the Western, the film noir, and the musical?
For the film noir, without question, Double Indemnity is the place to start. For the Western, we talked about The Searchers, and you really can't do much better than that. And we won't mention Fred Astaire because that's like Mozart. He's the best. My favorite film musical, other than The Music Man, is Meet Me in St. Louis.
Oh, yes. The trolley song.
Yes, with Judy Garland. You can't go wrong with any of those
My wife
films.
makes fun of me because I always sort of break down at the trolley song.
Oh, good for you. Good for you.
Terry Teachout, thank you for being my guest on the Church and Culture today. We thank you for being with us, and we'll see you next time.